The consequences are worldwide, long-term, and extremely serious.
Carl Sagan, while known more for his research in astronomy, also played a large role in the nuclear disarmament movement. Sagan took a strong stand against nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race during the Cold War in his books and during public discussions, which led others to follow in his footsteps.
Imagine a room awash in gasoline. And there are two implacable enemies in that room. One of them has 9,000 matches. The other has 7,000 matches. Each of them is concerned about who's ahead, who's stronger. Well, that's the kind of situation we are actually in. The amount of weapons that are available to the United States and the Soviet Union are so bloated, so grossly in excess of what's needed to dissuade the other, that if it weren't so tragic, it would be laughable. What is necessary is to reduce the matches and to clean up the gasoline.
Nuclear winter is the theory that explains the climatic catastrophe that would plague the Earth as a result of a nuclear war. For Sagan, the shocking realization of the potential harm nuclear weapons could cause the planet began in 1971 with the launching of Mariner 9 and its exploration of the planet Mars. Mariner 9 arrived on Mars only to find that the red planet was completely covered in a global dust storm.
There was an instrument on board the spacecraft which was able to measure the temperature at various levels in the Martian atmosphere and down to the surface despite the dust cover. And what the instrument showed was that the upper atmosphere was much warmer than was usual for Mars, and the surface was much colder than was usual for Mars. And qualitatively, the reason is very clear. The fine dust absorbs sunlight high up and heats the surrounding air. Because the fine dust absorbs the sunlight can't get down to the surface as much as it ordinarily does, and so the surface was cooler and darker.
Sagan and his colleagues soon began applying this knowledge to terrestrial problems. This group of researchers was eventually known as TAPS, standing for their last names Turco, Toon, Ackerman, Pollock, and Sagan. It wasn't long after the discovery that they published an investigative research paper entitled Global Atmospheric Consequences of Nuclear War, which is the foundation upon which the nuclear winter theory is based. In a brief summary, the nuclear winter theory states that if there were to be a nuclear war, there would be widespread fires that would lead to unfathomable amounts of smoke and soot being released into the sky, inevitably blocking the sun's heat and light from entering the atmosphere, which would result in global freezing and the death of the majority of Earth's vegetation and animal life.
Billions of people would die of starvation. That means that nuclear winter is by far the greatest threat to our global civilization and to our species.
While it isn't certain that the nuclear winter theory would reign true if an actual nuclear war were to occur, the TAPS study concluded that, nevertheless, the magnitudes of the first-order effects are so large and the implications so serious that we hope the scientific issues raised here will be vigorously and critically examined.
But in such an exchange, not everyone would be killed by the blast and the firestorm and the immediate radiation. There would be other agonies. The loss of loved ones, the legions of the burned and blinded and mutilated, the absence of medical care, disease, plague, long-lived radiation poisoning the soil and the water, the threat of tumors and stillbirths and malformed children, and the hopeless sense of a civilization destroyed for nothing. The knowledge that we could have prevented it and did not.
It was because of this revelation that Carl Sagan became a leading advocate for nuclear disarmament.
Conventional wisdom, no matter how deeply felt, may not be a reliable guide in an age of apocalyptic weapons. We need to do something inside our heads. We must change the way we ordinarily think about this.
On February 5th, 1987, 438 protesters were arrested during a march past the entrance to the 1,350 square mile Nevada test site for protesting the United States' first nuclear test of the year. Among the more than 400 arrested protesters was notable astronomer and anti-nuclear activist Carl Sagan. A spokesman for the Department of Energy said 433 of the arrested demonstrators, including several congressmen, were charged with trespassing, and 5 were charged with resisting arrest. The U.S. government responded to the protest by detonating the bomb 2 days earlier than originally planned.
Massive reductions in the nuclear arsenals could increase the security of the nations involved.
Whether it was writing it down in publications or speaking out during public broadcasts, Carl Sagan made it his goal to get the concept of nuclear winter and the idea of mass destruction due to a nuclear war, however large it may be, into the minds of the people. From 1971, Sagan, father of 5, spent the remainder of his life making the consequences of a potential nuclear war known and encouraging the U.S. government and other world leaders to think about taking steps to reduce their massive nuclear stockpiles.
What made Sagan controversial was that he proposed this theory and politicized it, and a lot of scientists thought that that wasn't the role of a scientist, and the scientist should say, well, here's what the science says, and leave it at that. Carl Sagan said, here's what the science says. The science says that if we allow a nuclear war to happen, then we run the risk of extinguishing human life on Earth, and we run the risk of these catastrophic consequences like nuclear winter. And because science tells us this, we need to move away from nuclear weapons as the center of our foreign policy and of our diplomacy. And it was that activist stance that really put him into the public eye as an activist, as an anti-nuclear activist. And so I think he absolutely would be considered one of the most important activist leaders of the disarmament and anti-nuclear movements of the 1980s. What Carl Sagan did was show how good science can be used for good activism, and that is a lesson that I think many of us need to follow today. Some of the opposition to Carl Sagan's anti-nuclear activism and his idea of nuclear winter came from other scientists who didn't believe that Sagan should be using science in that way, should be politicizing science. They believed that the scientists should leave the activism to the activists, and that scientists should just focus on the science. And so there were other scientists that were opposed to what Sagan said.
If we're willing to live with the growing likelihood of nuclear war, shouldn't we also be willing to explore vigorously every possible means to prevent nuclear war? Shouldn't we consider in every nation major changes in the traditional ways of doing things, a fundamental restructuring of economic, political, social, and religious institutions? We've reached a point where there can be no more special interests or special cases. Nuclear arms threaten every person on the earth.
Although many people don't recognize that Carl Sagan played an important role during the nuclear arms race, he is remembered as a man who was never afraid to take a stand against what he believed was morally wrong.
The technology you have to understand the nuclear arms race, to understand Star Wars, to understand any of these issues, is not more difficult than what you have to understand to follow the sports pages. And I believe there is a real obligation to get that information to the American people. Our lives may depend on it.